I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
Back to the story. What part 2 does best is refuse to move forward chronologically. Instead of progressing, it moves sideways. Moments from different years are placed next to each other without warning. A confident statement from the past sits beside a carefully worded pause today. On their own, each feels explainable. Together, they feel intentional. That's when discomfort sets in, not because anything new is claimed, but because old material stops feeling resolved. This chapter also trusts memory. It assumes you remember who denied what, who stayed quiet, who spoke early and then disappeared. It assumes you can feel the weight of what's missing just as much as what's present. That trust changes the relationship between the documentary and the viewer. You're no longer being guided, you're being implicated as a witness. And once a story shifts from watch this to remember this, it stops behaving like content and starts behaving like record. Nothing here is loud. Everything is patient. Patterns begin to form through proximity. The same faces in the same rooms across different years. The same tone used in completely different situations. Repetition like that doesn't feel accidental. It feels structural. And structure is what investigations are built on, not single incidents. By the time this first stretch settles, one thing becomes clear without being stated. This release isn't trying to end the conversation. It's trying to change how the conversation is watched. And once that happens, silence doesn't protect the way it used to. It starts to speak for itself. As the story moves forward, the tone tightens even more. Not because anything louder is revealed, but because the space for misunderstanding starts to shrink. Part 2 doesn't chase reactions. It studies alignment. It places moments close enough together that distance can no longer soften them. What begins to stand out is how familiar everything feels once it's compressed. Statements you've heard before, clips you remember seeing years ago, images that once passed without pause. Nothing new on the surface. Yet somehow everything feels different, because now these moments aren't separated by time. They're stacked. That stacking changes perception. When you see how often the same people move through the same rooms, the same circles, the same nights, coincidence becomes harder to lean on. The documentary never says that out loud. It doesn't need to. It lets repetition do the work. Repetition is quiet, but it's relentless. One of the most unsettling shifts here is how little explanation is offered. Long stretches pass without commentary. You're shown where people were, who else was present, and how often those configurations repeat. No labels, no conclusions, just proximity. And proximity forces memory to activate. You start remembering interviews that once felt confident, answers that once sounded complete. Now they feel partial, not false, partial. This chapter also pulls away from public timelines. It avoids moments that were designed to be seen. Instead, it lingers on the in-between. After parties, planning stages, conversations just before cameras were supposed to stop rolling. These aren't explosive scenes. They're ordinary, and that's what makes them effective. Ordinary moments, when repeated, reveal habits. Habits reveal systems. There's a noticeable emotional temperature change here. The earlier documentary carried a sense of exposure. This one carries consequence. The energy feels colder, more controlled, almost resigned, like the story has moved past shock and into a phase where reality settles quietly. That's when things become difficult to undo, because outrage fades. Records don't. Another thing that becomes impossible to ignore is the response outside the documentary. There's no aggressive pushback, no immediate attempt to dismantle what's being shown. Just carefully worded statements insisting narratives are being misunderstood. That response raises its own question. If nothing here holds weight, why not confront it directly? Why allow implication to linger instead of closing the loop? This part never accuses, it reframes. It shows how narratives were managed publicly versus privately. What was said on record, what was handled off camera, how often those two worlds never fully aligned. It doesn't claim deception, it highlights separation. And separation allows plausible deniability, enough distance for multiple interpretations to exist without ever colliding. As these moments continue to stack, the viewer's role changes again. You're no longer watching to learn what happened. You're watching to observe how people move now that the past is being reassembled instead of forgotten. Every pause is noticed. Every silence is measured. Every choice not to engage becomes part of the record. This is where the pressure starts to build. Not loudly but steadily. The documentary leans into repetition, not repeating clips, but repeating behavior. The same types of responses across different years. The same reliance on reputation to fill gaps where explanations should be. The same assumption that time will soften perception. That assumption is being tested here. Because the audience isn't reacting emotionally anymore. They're watching structurally, comparing tone, comparing timing, noticing how explanations stop just before specificity would force alignment. Nothing dramatic happens. And that's exactly why it works. Explosions burn out. Patterns settle in. By the time this section ends, the viewer understands something quietly definitive. This story isn't being kept alive by new information. It's being kept alive by what remains unresolved. And unresolved doesn't disappear. It waits. As the picture continues to tighten, the story stops feeling like a documentary and starts feeling like a test. Not of truth or lies, but of attention, of memory, of whether the audience is willing to notice what used to slide past unnoticed. Because now the pattern isn't just visible, it's consistent. What begins to surface here is how often control shows up not through force, but through rhythm. The same cadence of response, the same calm tone during moments that should demand urgency, the same strategic distance when clarity would normally follow. Once you notice that rhythm, it becomes impossible to stop hearing it. This part doesn't introduce new characters. It revisits familiar ones and places them in a different light, not by changing what they said, but by changing where those words sit in the timeline. A confident quote from years ago lands next to a present-day silence, a moment once framed as leadership now echoes with restraint. Nothing is edited to shock, it's edited to compare. And comparison is dangerous. Because when answers from different eras start sounding the same, you stop asking whether someone is telling the truth. You start asking why the response never evolves, why every explanation feels carefully sized, large enough to acknowledge, small enough to avoid consequence. The documentary slows even further here, and that patience is intentional. It lets silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. Not dramatic silence, familiar silence, the kind that used to feel mature, controlled, respectable, but now after everything that's been lined up, it feels different, it feels chosen. One of the most effective moves in this stretch is what the camera refuses to do. It doesn't chase reaction shots, it doesn't cut to outrage, it doesn't tell you how to feel, it simply stays still while the weight builds. And in that stillness, you begin to recognize how often stillness itself was used as a tool. Time was never neutral here. Time was protection. Statements were made just long enough to stop momentum. Clarifications were offered without timelines. Concern was expressed without ownership. Then time was allowed to pass, quietly smoothing the edges. And for years that worked, because attention moved on. Headlines changed. Memory fragmented. But this documentary doesn't let time do that anymore. By compressing years into minutes, it removes the buffer that once made everything feel distant. Moments that were separated by decades now sit back to back. And when that happens, the gaps become louder than the footage itself. You start noticing how often questions were acknowledged but never answered. How many times accountability was discussed in theory but never placed in practice. How frequently responsibility became abstract, floating, unassigned. Nothing here claims wrongdoing. That's not the point. The point is continuity. Continuity of tone, continuity of language, continuity of distance, and continuity suggests intention. As this section unfolds, the audience's relationship to the story shifts again. You're no longer absorbing information. You're measuring behavior. You're watching how narratives adjust when pressure increases quietly, not publicly. You're noticing who grows more specific and who retreats into generalities. Specificity creates reference points. Reference points invite comparison. Comparison removes control. That's why so much effort appears to have gone into avoiding it. The documentary highlights how often engagement stopped just before clarity would be forced, how explanations ended where timelines should begin, how silence filled the space where alignment would otherwise be required. And the most unsettling part is how effective this strategy has been for so long. Not because people were fooled, but because the system didn't need to fool anyone. It only needed patience. Let discomfort cool. Let curiosity fade. Let time do what denial never could. But something has changed. The audience isn't rushing anymore. They're waiting. They're watching how often the same structures reappear around different controversies, how the same methods surface regardless of context, how the language remains measured even when stakes rise. Repetition like this doesn't shock, it convinces. Because once behavior becomes predictable, coincidence stops being a comfortable explanation. This is where the story grows heavier without adding volume. No new bombshell drops. No dramatic reveal. Just accumulation. And accumulation is what turns observation into recognition. By now, the viewer isn't asking what's coming next. They're asking why so much of the past feels unfinished. Why so many moments were allowed to pass without resolution. Why silence was so often treated as closure. Silence doesn't resolve stories. It suspends them. And suspended stories create tension that doesn't disappear when the screen goes dark. It lingers. It tightens. It changes how every new movement is interpreted. This part leaves you with a realization that doesn't need to be spoken aloud. The story no longer belongs to the people at its center. It belongs to the timeline, to memory, to pattern. And once pattern replaces noise, there's no easy way back. Because from here on, every pause will be noticed. Every absence will be felt. Every non-response will carry weight it didn't before. Not because anything new was proven, but because nothing unresolved can hide behind time anymore. By this point, the tension no longer comes from what's being shown. It comes from what's being withheld. The documentary doesn't feel like it's building toward a reveal anymore. It feels like it's removing places to hide. What becomes clearer here is that silence isn't accidental. It has a shape, a timing, a pattern. And once you start seeing that shape, it starts appearing everywhere. This stretch leans hard into contrast. Public confidence versus private restraint. Statements made when cameras were rolling versus decisions made when they weren't. The difference isn't dramatic, it's subtle. And that subtlety is what makes it dangerous, because subtle strategies survive longer than loud ones. Moments that were once dismissed as isolated now feel coordinated when placed next to each other. A controversy surfaces, a response follows, brief, careful, incomplete. Attention peaks, then time steps in and does the rest. Time becomes the cleanup crew, not resolving anything, just spacing it out enough for urgency to dissolve. The documentary doesn't accuse this pattern. It exposes it by repetition. You start noticing how often explanations stop just short of clarity, how frequently timelines are avoided, how accountability is acknowledged broadly but never anchored to a specific decision or moment. Nothing false is said, but nothing complete is said either. And incompleteness, when repeated, stops feeling accidental. It starts feeling like method. This is where the story stops feeling personal and starts feeling systemic. Less about one individual moment, more about how moments were consistently handled across years. The same language appearing in different eras, the same tone applied to unrelated situations, the same calm distance maintained regardless of stakes. Calm, in this context, doesn't feel reassuring anymore. It feels controlled. Another layer quietly emerges here, absence. Not just what's shown, but who fades out of the frame. Names that were once front and center now appear less often. Voices that used to speak freely grow careful, minimal, or disappear entirely. Absence, when repeated, becomes its own kind of statement. The documentary never explains this. It doesn't have to. It trusts the viewer to notice that disappearance tends to happen at the same point every time, right when context would matter most. And that's where the pressure deepens, because the audience has stopped consuming. They're evaluating, measuring tone, measuring timing, measuring how quickly narratives adjust when scrutiny increases quietly rather than explosively. This is where power usually expects attention to fade, where fatigue should set in, where viewers should move on. But that's not what happens here. Instead of fading, the weight increases, not through outrage, through awareness. Old interviews resurface and feel different. Answers that once sounded confident now feel rehearsed. Statements that were accepted at face value now feel selective. Not dishonest, selective. Designed to satisfy the moment without creating a trail that could be followed later. Selection is control. The documentary begins to show how often responsibility was dispersed instead of placed, how concern was expressed without consequence, how regret was implied without ownership. Each instance on its own feels explainable. Together they form a structure, and structures don't maintain themselves by accident. What's especially unsettling is realizing how effective this approach has been for so long, not because people were naive, but because the system didn't require belief. It only required patience. Let time soften edges. Let memory fragment. Let new headlines replace old questions. But patience only works when people stop comparing. This documentary forces comparison. By collapsing years into a single flow, it removes the illusion that these moments were unrelated. Gaps that once felt natural now feel intentional. Pauses feel heavier. Silences feel louder. You start asking a different kind of question. Not is this true, but why does this response always look the same? That question doesn't demand proof. It demands recognition. And once recognition sets in, the balance shifts again. Silence stops feeling like restraint. It starts feeling like choice. This is the point where the story gains gravity. Gravity doesn't rush. It pulls, slowly, relentlessly. The documentary lets that pull do the work. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't dramatize. It simply stays with the discomfort long enough for it to settle in. Because once the audience starts watching reactions instead of revelations, everything changes. Who speaks, who doesn't, who grows vague, who creates distance. Those decisions begin to matter more than any single piece of footage. By the end of this stretch, one thing becomes unavoidable. The story no longer belongs to headlines or official statements. It belongs to memory, to pattern, to the accumulation of moments that were never fully addressed. And accumulation is harder to escape than accusation, because accusations can be denied. Patterns just sit there, waiting. This is where the story quietly crosses a line it can't step back over. Not because something shocking is announced, but because the way everything fits together becomes impossible to ignore. Up to this point, it was still possible to treat each moment as separate. Different years, different situations, different explanations. But here, that separation collapses. The documentary doesn't add new accusations. It does something far more disruptive. It shows continuity. Moments from the past are no longer framed as history. They're framed as precedent. You begin to see how early behaviors mirror later outcomes. How language used decades ago reappears almost unchanged during moments of crisis. How confidence never wavers, even when circumstances demand accountability. This isn't coincidence, it's consistency. And consistency changes how everything is read. This section brings the viewer face to face with a realization that doesn't feel dramatic at first, but lands heavily once it settles in. Power doesn't protect itself by denying everything. It protects itself by managing perception, by deciding when to speak, how much to say, and when silence will do more work than words ever could. That's the turning point. Because once you recognize that strategy, every past response rearranges itself. Statements that once sounded reassuring now feel incomplete. Pauses that once felt dignified now feel calculated. Distance that was framed as maturity now looks like insulation. The documentary doesn't explain this shift. It lets the audience feel it. You're shown how moments of controversy were often followed by carefully timed visibility, appearances, interviews, public gestures meant to stabilize perception rather than resolve questions. Each move on its own feels reasonable. Together, they reveal a pattern of containment. Containment doesn't erase problems. It limits how far they spread. This is also where the role of environment becomes unavoidable. Not just industry environment, but the environments that shaped how power was understood long before fame entered the picture. How loyalty was modeled, how silence was rewarded, how influence was exercised without appearing forceful. The documentary doesn't claim cause and effect. It doesn't say one thing led directly to another. It places moments side by side and asks the viewer to sit with the resemblance. That resemblance is unsettling, because when the same structures appear in childhood stories, business dealings, and public responses, coincidence starts to feel like an excuse rather than an explanation. You begin to see how certain behaviors weren't learned later. They were refined. This is where the tension shifts from curiosity to consequence. The audience isn't asking what else exists anymore. They're asking how much of what already exists was ignored because it was inconvenient to confront. How many times familiarity was mistaken for normality? How often influence made uncomfortable dynamics feel acceptable? And this is where silence becomes loud. Not the silence of denial, the silence of calculation. The kind that appears when speaking would require alignment between stories that were never meant to touch. The kind that shows up when explanation would create a trail, and trails invite scrutiny. The documentary doesn't rush through this realization. It slows everything down. It lets you sit with the weight of recognition, because once you see how the system operates, you can't unknow it. This is the moment where the story stops being about footage and starts being about framework, about how crises were navigated, about how responsibility was diffused, about how narratives were softened rather than clarified, about how time was used as a tool, not to heal but to outlast attention. The most uncomfortable part is understanding how effective this has been. Not because people were blind, but because the system didn't need blindness. It only needed exhaustion. It only needed patience. But patience stops working when patterns are visible, and that's what happens here. The viewer realizes that nothing needs to be proven for the pressure to exist. The pressure comes from recognition, from the sense that what's being observed isn't random. It's procedural. Procedures don't panic when questioned. They wait. And waiting in this context no longer feels safe. By the end of this stretch, the story feels fundamentally different. Not louder, not angrier, heavier, because it's no longer driven by new information. It's driven by understanding. Understanding how power repeats itself. Understanding how silence functions. Understanding how systems protect continuity over clarity. From here on, every response will be measured against this realization. Every pause will be interpreted differently. Every absence will carry meaning it didn't before. This is the point of no return. Not because a line was crossed publicly, but because the audience crossed it privately. And once that happens, the story doesn't need escalation anymore. It already has gravity. From this point forward, the pressure doesn't come from what might be revealed next. It comes from what can no longer be dismissed. The documentary stops asking the viewer to follow along and starts asking them to remember, to recall how many times similar moments were written off as isolated, how often discomfort was smoothed over by familiarity, how easily repetition hid in plain sight when it was spread across years instead of minutes. Now that time has been collapsed, something becomes obvious. The story never needed a single explosive moment to hold it together. It relied on accumulation, on how small, incomplete answers stacked quietly without ever resolving the questions beneath them. This section leans into that accumulation, not with new footage, but with context. Old interviews replayed without commentary, casual remarks heard without distraction, jokes that once landed as charm, now sitting differently when framed by everything that followed. Nothing is altered, only placement changes, and placement changes meaning. You start noticing how often certainty was expressed early and how restraint replaced it later, how confidence gave way to careful phrasing, how explanations became shorter as scrutiny grew sharper. That shift isn't framed as guilt or innocence. It's framed as adaptation, and adaptation is the clearest sign that pressure is being felt. The documentary quietly highlights how visibility is managed during moments of risk. When to appear, when to retreat, when to speak broadly, when to say nothing at all. These choices aren't presented as defensive. They're presented as habitual, the same moves appearing across different controversies, different years, different contexts. Habit is powerful because it doesn't require conscious intent. It runs on instinct. And instinct reveals what someone believes will work. This is where the audience begins to see how influence operates beyond individual actions, how it moves through people, through institutions, through silence itself. Silence here is an emptiness. It's structure. It holds shape. It directs attention away from specifics and toward abstraction. Abstract concern, abstract accountability, abstract regret. Everything acknowledged, nothing resolved. The documentary doesn't tell you this is deliberate. It shows you how often it happens. And repetition does the rest. You start to feel how waiting became the default response. Let time pass. Let attention shift. Let new stories replace old ones. Waiting has always been the safest strategy because waiting relies on fatigue. But fatigue only works when people stop comparing. Here, comparison is unavoidable. Moments once separated by distance now sit side by side. A promise made early, a pause later, a question deferred, an answer that never arrives. The through line becomes visible, and with it, the realization that silence wasn't the absence of response. It was the response. That's when the tension changes texture. It's no longer sharp, it's dense. You're not bracing for a reveal. You're weighing behavior, watching how each move aligns with the pattern already established. Who maintains distance? Who shifts tone? Who suddenly disappears from the conversation altogether? Absence becomes information, and the documentary trusts the viewer enough to recognize that without explanation. It doesn't underline it, it doesn't repeat it, it lets absence speak. What's especially unsettling is how normal all of this once felt, how easily familiarity softened scrutiny, how often power disguised itself as stability, how restraint was praised without asking what it was restraining. This section forces the viewer to confront that normalization, to realize how many moments were accepted because they fit expectations, because they didn't disrupt the flow, because they arrived packaged as professionalism instead of avoidance. But professionalism doesn't answer questions. It delays them, and delayed questions don't disappear. They collect interest. By now, the story no longer feels like it's unfolding. It feels like it's closing in. Not on a person, but on a system that learned how to survive attention without resolving anything. A system that relied on patience, distance, and selective engagement to maintain control. The audience doesn't need to be convinced of anything at this stage. They're already participating, already measuring, already noticing how each new silence reinforces the structure that's been revealed. This is where the documentary becomes most uncomfortable, not because it shocks, but because it refuses to let comfort return. It doesn't give release. It doesn't provide closure. It leaves you inside the realization. That realization being this: once you see how power manages itself over time, you start seeing it everywhere. And once you see it, you can't stop looking for it. From here on, every reaction will be interpreted through this lens. Every response will be weighed not by what it says, but by what it avoids. Every pause will feel deliberate. And that's the shift that matters most. Because the story no longer needs momentum, it has awareness. And awareness doesn't fade. By now, the story no longer feels like it's moving forward. It feels like it's circling back. Not to repeat itself, but to close in. This final stretch doesn't add noise. It adds clarity. What becomes undeniable here is that nothing about this situation exists in isolation anymore. Every past decision, every public statement, every moment of silence now sits inside a larger frame. A frame built not by accusations, but by alignment, by how events, responses, and absences line up once time is stripped away as a shield. The documentary pulls the camera back and lets the full ecosystem come into view. Not just individuals, but the structures around them, the relationships that stayed intact, the businesses that kept moving forward, the media narratives that softened edges instead of sharpening questions, the loyalty that held firm even as discomfort grew. Because this was never just about protecting an image. It was about preserving continuity. As pressure increased over the years, nothing collapsed outwardly. Instead, strategies evolved. When criticism surfaced, it was reframed. When scrutiny intensified, attention was redirected. When legal questions appeared, Layers were added, not to erase what happened, but to manage how it was remembered. Memory management becomes the quiet theme here. The documentary shows how moments of crisis were often followed by strategic visibility, carefully timed appearances, statements designed to reassure without clarifying, content meant to remind the public who someone was supposed to be, not who people were beginning to question. And each time, it worked just long enough for momentum to slow. But momentum hasn't slowed this time, because something fundamental has changed. The audience isn't reacting. They're observing. They're no longer asking for answers in the moment. They're comparing answers across time. And comparison is where control weakens. Old interviews replay with new weight. Jokes once brushed off now feel loaded. Confidence that once felt unshakable now feels rehearsed. Not because the footage changed, but because the context did. That's the power of reframing. The documentary never claims guilt. It doesn't need to. It presents something more unsettling: continuity. The sense that what people are seeing now didn't emerge suddenly. It was refined, maintained, protected, and passed forward through environments that normalized silence, rewarded loyalty, and treated distance as strength. This is where the story stops feeling like a fall from grace and starts feeling like a reckoning with origins, with how power is learned, how influence is modeled, how systems teach people what works long before the world is watching. And once those lessons are learned, they don't disappear, they scale. The final moments linger on contrast. On one side, polished narratives of resilience and misunderstanding. On the other, years of footage, testimony, and patterns that refuse to stay isolated. The gap between those two versions is where the tension now lives. The viewer is left with a choice, but not the kind that demands outrage. A quieter one, a more permanent one. Which version feels more complete? The one being sold now, or the one that emerges when everything is placed side by side? Because clarity doesn't arrive with a single revelation. It arrives when ignoring the pattern becomes harder than acknowledging it. That's why this story doesn't end here. It doesn't resolve. It doesn't close neatly. It enters a new phase. One where every future move will be read differently, where every pause will carry meaning, where silence no longer feels neutral. From this point forward, the pressure isn't coming from what might be released next. It's coming from what already exists. And once awareness replaces doubt, time stops being a shield. It becomes a record. At this stage, the story doesn't need to convince anyone of anything. It only needs to keep the lens steady. What happens next is subtle, but it changes how every earlier moment is remembered. The documentary stops tracking events and starts tracking reactions. Not the reactions you expect, but the ones that arrive late. The delayed statements, the careful recalibrations, the sudden shifts in language that only appear once patterns have already been noticed. You begin to see how timing itself becomes a message. When responses come quickly, they're confident. When they arrive slowly, they're cautious. When they don't arrive at all, they leave space. And space in this context doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels intentional. Like a decision made with full awareness of what silence can accomplish. The film quietly places these reactions next to the moments that triggered them, not to judge, but to compare. A crisis emerges. A tension builds. A measured response appears. Then time passes. Then another moment resurfaces years later, handled the same way. The similarity isn't loud, it's precise. Precision suggests rehearsal. What stands out most here is how often narratives adjust without acknowledging that they've adjusted. The story isn't denied, it's reframed. The focus shifts from specifics to generalities, from timelines to themes, from responsibility to perspective. Each move reduces friction without closing the loop, and the loop stays open. The documentary doesn't underline this. It lets the viewer feel it through repetition. Because repetition turns observation into expectation. You start anticipating the next move before it happens. You know when a statement will be broad. You know when clarity will be postponed. You know when distance will replace engagement. Predictability is the tell. Once behavior becomes predictable, it stops feeling situational. It starts feeling structural. And structures don't rely on individual intent. They rely on what's been proven to work over time. This is where the audience begins to understand how influence survives scrutiny. Not by overpowering it, but by outlasting it. Not by arguing every point, but by choosing which points deserve oxygen. The rest are left to fade, not because they're resolved, but because time is expected to do the work. But time isn't working the same way anymore. Because the documentary has changed how time is experienced. It compresses, it stacks, it refuses to let years soften memory. Old moments return without warning, stripped of the context that once made them feel harmless. When you hear them now, they land differently. Not because they're new, because you are. You've watched enough to recognize the pattern, enough to understand that silence doesn't always mean nothing happened. Sometimes it means something didn't need to be said to achieve the desired outcome. The film also widens the lens to show how these dynamics ripple outward, how institutions respond when proximity becomes uncomfortable, how partnerships quietly reassess risk, how narratives shift not through announcements, but through absence. Less visibility, fewer appearances, smaller statements, distance increases, and distance, once established, becomes the new normal. This part lingers on that normalization, on how quickly people adapt to quieter presences, how easily reduced engagement is accepted as maturity, how often restraint is praised without asking what it's restraining. The documentary doesn't answer that question. It lets it hang. Because unanswered questions create pressure that doesn't explode. It accumulates. It settles. It changes how every new development is interpreted. From this point on, nothing arrives cleanly. Everything is filtered through memory. The viewer starts to realize that the story no longer needs updates to remain relevant. It's self-sustaining. It feeds on its own unresolved edges, on the contrast between what's been said and what's been avoided. That contrast becomes the engine. By the time this section ends, the feeling isn't anticipation, it's calibration. The audience has recalibrated how they listen, how they watch, how they interpret silence. They're no longer waiting to be told what matters. They're deciding, and that decision quietly shifts the balance. Because once an audience moves from reaction to evaluation, the space for control narrows. Not immediately, not dramatically, but permanently. From here on, every pause will be weighed. Every response will be compared. Every absence will be noticed, not as proof, as pattern. And patterns, once recognized, don't need reinforcement. They persist on their own. That's the pressure now living beneath the surface. And it isn't going anywhere. At this point, the story stops behaving like something that needs momentum. It already has it. What it needs now is stillness. This is where the documentary becomes almost uncomfortable in how calm it is. No urgency, no escalation, just a quiet confidence that everything necessary is already on the table. The pressure doesn't come from what's added. It comes from what can no longer be dismissed. What starts to register here is how deeply normalized certain behaviors became over time. Not because anyone forced acceptance, but because repetition created familiarity. And familiarity has a way of dulling instinct. Things that might have raised questions early on began to feel routine simply because they kept happening without consequence. The documentary doesn't highlight this directly. It shows it through rhythm, through how often similar responses appear in completely different situations, through how consistently the same strategies are applied regardless of context. Once you see that rhythm, you realize it's been there the whole time. This section leans into memory. Not memory as nostalgia, but memory as comparison. Old footage doesn't return as a callback. It returns as a checkpoint. You hear the same language. You see the same confidence. You notice the same deflection points. And suddenly, moments that once felt isolated start aligning with unsettling precision. Alignment changes everything. Because alignment suggests preparation. Not preparation for one specific incident, but preparation for scrutiny itself. An understanding that attention comes and goes, and that waiting it out is often more effective than confronting it. That principle shows up again and again, quietly reinforcing itself. The documentary begins to show how often silence functioned as a stabilizer. When engagement would have fueled questions, distance cooled them. When explanation might have created accountability, restraint preserved flexibility. Nothing dramatic, nothing overt, just consistent. Consistency is the signal. What's especially striking is how rarely this approach failed. For years, it worked exactly as intended. Attention moved on, context faded, new stories replaced old ones, and unresolved questions were quietly filed away as history. But this documentary refuses to let history stay compartmentalized. By collapsing timelines, it forces unresolved moments to coexist. A statement made early is heard alongside an outcome that followed years later. A moment of certainty is placed next to a later pause. That proximity removes excuses. You begin to feel the weight of how often time was used as insulation, how many times waiting became the answer, how frequently patience was mistaken for resolution. And once you recognize that, patience stops feeling neutral. It feels strategic. This is where the viewer's relationship to the story shifts again. You're no longer assessing information. You're assessing intent. Not intent in the legal sense, but intent in the behavioral sense. What patterns suggest about expectations? About confidence in systems that have historically absorbed pressure without breaking. The documentary doesn't accuse those systems. It lets them reveal themselves. You start noticing how often responsibility was acknowledged without being placed, how concern was expressed without specificity, how language stayed broad enough to avoid friction, yet present enough to appear engaged. That balance is difficult to maintain accidentally. This is where the tension deepens, not spikes. It becomes internal. You're no longer waiting for something to happen. You're processing what already has. And that's far more destabilizing, because when understanding replaces anticipation, the story stops offering relief. There's no payoff moment, no single scene where everything clicks and releases. Instead, the realization spreads slowly, quietly, permanently. The documentary trusts the audience to carry that realization forward. It doesn't explain it. It doesn't summarize it. It simply lets the pattern sit long enough for recognition to settle in. By now, the audience isn't asking whether something will be addressed. They're asking why so much never was. Why silence appeared at the same points repeatedly. Why engagement always stopped just before alignment would be required. Those questions don't demand answers. They demand acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, once internalized, doesn't fade when the screen goes dark. That's where this part leaves you. Not with shock, not with outrage, with awareness. And awareness is the one thing time can't erase. Now the weight of the story shifts again, not forward, but inward. This is where the documentary stops asking what happened and starts asking how it was allowed to keep happening without interruption. Because by now, the audience has seen enough to recognize that this isn't about isolated moments slipping through cracks. It's about cracks being managed so carefully that nothing ever fully breaks. What becomes clearer here is how protection doesn't always look like defense. Sometimes it looks like structure, like systems that know exactly how much pressure they can absorb before adjusting. Not collapsing, adjusting. The documentary lingers on how narratives evolve without ever being corrected. Early confidence slowly gives way to controlled ambiguity. Language becomes softer. Statements become shorter. Responsibility becomes dispersed. Not denied, dispersed. Spread thin enough that it never lands in one place. That dispersion is powerful, because when responsibility is everywhere, it's nowhere. This section highlights how often the same cycle repeated. Attention spikes, a response appears. Not a full one, just enough to slow momentum. Then silence. Then time. And time, historically, did the rest. It turned urgency into background noise. It transformed unanswered questions into old news. What's different now is that the audience is no longer consuming this cycle in real time. They're seeing it compressed, side by side, without the long pauses that once made everything feel less connected. Compression removes comfort. You start noticing how often people spoke around issues instead of through them, how carefully words were chosen to acknowledge concern without inviting follow-up, how statements felt complete on first listen, but hollow on second glance. This isn't framed as deception, it's framed as technique, a technique refined through repetition. The documentary doesn't suggest that anyone planned for a specific outcome. It suggests something more unsettling, that certain approaches became instinctive because they consistently worked, when silence resolved more than explanation, when distance created less risk than engagement. Instinct is revealing, because instinct shows what someone expects will protect them. As this part unfolds, the audience starts tracking not just who speaks, but who stops speaking, who fades out when context would matter most, who becomes less visible as scrutiny becomes more focused. Absence begins to feel coordinated, not coincidental. The documentary never labels it that way. It doesn't need to. It simply lets the pattern repeat until recognition becomes unavoidable. You begin to understand how power can remain intact without ever asserting itself openly. How influence doesn't need to argue. It just needs to wait, to let uncertainty linger, to let fatigue set in. But fatigue isn't setting in this time because awareness has replaced it. The viewer is no longer reacting emotionally. They're watching behaviorally, measuring how each response fits into the larger pattern already revealed. The question isn't, is this true anymore? It's, why does this response look exactly like the others? That question changes everything. It turns every new statement into a reference point, every pause into a data point, every non-response into confirmation of method, not meaning. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for a different reason. Not because it shocks, but because it stabilizes. It settles into something that feels consistent enough to be trusted, even without proof. And consistency is persuasive. The documentary leans into that persuasion by doing less. It stops introducing material aggressively. It lets silence stretch. It lets absence linger. It trusts that the audience now understands how to read those signals. By now, the viewer realizes that the story doesn't need a climax to feel complete. The climax already happened quietly, the moment recognition replaced doubt. From here on, every future development will be filtered through this lens. Not judged in isolation, but compared, stacked, measured against what came before. That's the shift that matters. Because once a narrative is measured instead of consumed, it loses its ability to reset. It can't rely on time to soften edges anymore. The audience won't allow it. This part leaves you with a heavy understanding, not an emotional one, but a structural one. That what you're watching isn't a series of events. It's a system revealing itself. And systems don't disappear when attention moves on. They wait, but now they're being watched.